Right, morning everyone. So today we're talking about psychophysiology, referring to the functioning of the atomic nervous system. Does anyone know who this man is here on the left? Ted Kaczynski, right, the Unabomber who sent bombs mainly to university professors, airline workers. He was on a crusade against those who he thought were advancing technology. Okay, there were over 30 people injured from his bombs that were sent across the US. 3 people died. Okay, and I asked the question, what does he have in common with this bomb diffuser on the right? The obvious answer is that one builds bombs, one diffuses bombs, but there's a bit more in common than just that, right? To do what both of these did, it takes a degree of fearlessness, right? In order to put together a bomb, in order to walk on a university campus, for example, and deliver a bomb. And then also the job, of course, of diffusing a bomb and trying not to imagine that it could go off, right? And when bomb diffusers are questionnaires and interviewed, they do often report not thinking about the fact that the bomb could go off. The fear of death isn't something they think about. It's something that they completely are able to, put aside, which would be something, too difficult for most people to do. So there's a degree of fearlessness, and both also highly intelligent, right? This is a skilled job that takes a lot of training, a lot of education. Ted Kaczynski was a maths prodigy, majored in mathematics, and was a professor at the University of Berkeley in California. And then he retired to the rural lands of Montana, living in a shack out of nowhere. And he was only really discovered once he sent out his manifesto, and his brother, his family, discovered language in the manifesto that they could place to Ted Kaczynski. The FBI were skeptical at first. They went to his place in Montana, not really expecting for him to be guilty. But then they found a live bomb there waiting for them that had to be defused at the Montana cabin. So what I'm going to argue in this lecture is that for most individuals, they experience fear, anxiety in response to particular stressors. This is reflective of the atomic nervous system functioning as it typically does. But in some individuals, the atomic nervous system does not function as is typical, okay? Predisposing one to be more fearless, more courageous, if you would call it that in some circumstances. So the atomic nervous system, of course, part of the peripheral nervous system, right? You have the central nervous system for your brain and spinal cord, peripheral nervous system for the other areas of the nervous system. When we talk about the atomic nervous system, we're talking about that which controls bodily functions automatically, right? And the ones I want to focus on are sweat production and heart rate, okay? So these are not things you have conscious control over, right? They're run automatically. You could slow down your heart rate for breathing exercises and so on. You could have some control, but for the most part, these operate without us having to be consciously aware of the fact, right? Now, thinking about how this corresponds to feelings of anxiety, fear, I'll give you an example. Maybe imagine that last night you committed a horrific crime, okay? You decided last night you took someone's life. Maybe the roommate who's been pissing you off and decided you were going to, give them a surprise attack on their run, or maybe you were needing some cash, so you decided to go to the store in town and you got a gun from somewhere, you decided to shoot one and rob it was in the cashier. what would you be feeling like today? Probably you wouldn't really be concentrating on what I'm saying, right? You'd be thinking over everything that had happened. Are you going to get caught? Was there anyone who saw you? Did you leave behind any evidence? You would maybe be panicking a bit, worrying if the police are going to show up. And then what if the police did show up and say they wanted to speak to you, right? Your heart rate would probably be going, right? So you would be feeling some lightheadedness, okay? Your breathing would probably be at a quickened rate. And then maybe they were interrogating you, right? How would you deal during that? Knowing that any kind of slip, okay, would get you in trouble, right? You did commit murder in the state of Carolina, right, which has the death penalty. You given the death penalty, you're given the choice between a firing squad and the electric chair, right? So that might be something that's on your mind, right? If you're in an interrogation process such as this, any little slip will have you caught. So what's that really reflective of is the autonomic nervous system functioning, right? But what I'm going to argue is that for some individuals, psychopathic offenders, for example, they wouldn't be reacting the same way. Okay, if they did that crime last night that would disgust you, I would imagine, to think about it, they would be able to put it aside, okay, and think about just what they're doing today. You wouldn't be feeling that sense of panic when in an interrogation with the police. Okay. Now, some of this fear response is innate. Okay, there are some natural fears, but a lot of it is a process of conditioning, right? If you were, for example, driving on the freeway, maybe you're going over the speed limits, or maybe you're texting on your phone, and then suddenly blue lights turn on behind you, and there's the siren. That's going to get your heart rates going up, right? Because you know that that's meaning trouble for you, right? But when you were an infant and you saw a police car go by, that didn't get your heart rates going up. So this was a process of conditioning, right? Because you began to associate the fact that if you're speeding or doing something wrong on the road, and then you see the police, that could have bad consequences for you. But for those who have a poorly functioning autonomic nervous system, conditioning doesn't occur like this. Okay, so they don't form that association between stimuli that could lead to bad consequences or bad outcomes. Okay. Now, when we're measuring this, obviously heart rate is pretty simple to measure. Okay, average beats per minute. For sweat production, we usually use electrodes. Okay, we can have an electrode on each fingertip, and then we can measure the speed of the electrical signal getting from one electrode to the other. Okay, the quicker the speed, then the more the person is sweating. Now, in Adrian Rain's first study at the University of York in England, he found that children with a lower heart rate and who sweated less, years later, were more likely to be antisocial and more likely to be criminal at age 24. Okay, so we have all of these children who've had their heart rate and sweat production measured at age 15. And then 9 years later, we followed up to see if any have got into trouble with the law, have a criminal conviction. Those who do are in red, okay? And you can see at age 15, their sweat production much, much lower than those who grew up to be non-criminals. Heart rates significantly lower than those who grew up to be non-criminals, okay? Now, this is the first kind of study that's opening up this area of research, okay? This is a better study, a longitudinal study in Mauritius, okay? Much younger this time. We have about 1,800 3-year-old children, okay? And we're measuring their heart rates much younger this time, so age 3. And then measuring their antisocial behavior at age 11, controlling for potential confounds, so body size, socioeconomic status, any health conditions, ADHD diagnoses, okay? And again, what we're finding is that the children who are rated as being aggressive, so the blue, significantly lower heart rate, even at age 3. Okay, so it's a long-term predictor. You may also notice the sex difference. Okay, on average, girls do have a heart rate that's about 6 beats per minute faster than boys. Okay, it emerges at around age 3 and then is stable. Okay, across the life. We've talked already about a number of sex differences. Okay, that might contribute to the differences in crime rates, right? This, of course, isn't going to explain all of the difference, but it might be one, again, small piece of the puzzle. But these are generalizations, okay, on average. Let's be careful not to make predictions about any particular individuals, because none of these individuals at age 3 with a low resting heart rate were determined to grow up to be criminal. And I'll give you some examples of that, okay? Because years later, Rain followed up again to see if any had a criminal conviction. And we can look at the boy at age 3 who had the lowest heart rate and the girl at age 3 who had the lowest heart rate. The boy called Raj did grow up to be a psychopathic offender, okay, in trouble with the law. When he was interviewed for the research, he said that his relationships were all about status and dominance over others. When asked if anyone ever intimidates him, he said, absolutely not. If anyone tried to intimidate me, I would beat them up. Always wanting to show dominance over others. And for him, you know, a relationship was really valued by who was able to strike more fear in the other. When the interviewer asked about his girlfriend, he laughed and said, yeah, she's afraid of me too. Okay. In comparison to the girl with the lowest heart rate, okay, she did not grow up to be a criminal, okay. In 2011, she competed in the Miss World competition as Miss Mauritius, okay. So also someone who was maybe sensation-seeking and was able to travel the world and have a lot of attention and experiences and so on, is certainly not someone who grew up to be criminal. Now, obviously, it's hard to compare because the fact that she's female means the odds of her committing a crime are less anyway, okay? But it's still illustrating the point, right, that there's going to be differences even amongst those who have the low resting heart rates early in life. In fact, meta-analyses tell us that low resting heart rate is probably the second best biological predictor after prefrontal cortex dysfunction when it comes to predicting crime. Okay, certainly the second most robust across the literature. We can measure heart rates at rest, and we can measure heart rates during a stressor. Okay, the difference between psychopathic offenders and controls is greater when it comes to during a stressor rather than resting heart rate, meaning that this is a stronger effect, okay? In fact, it's a very strong effect from this meta-analysis, right? It's nearly 0.8, okay? That's the same relationship between the success of sleeping pills and helping with insomnia. It's the same relationship between high school grades and college grades, okay? And it's dwarfing relationships that we accept as being real relationships, like the relationship between smoking and cancer, okay? It's dwarfing that by far. It's also a finding that holds up across cultures and across other species, okay? From rabbits to shrews to mice, okay? Many different mammals have been observed. Same finding that those with a lower resting heart rate, more aggressive, more predatory, okay? And interestingly, it's diagnostic specific. All of the other biological factors I'm going to tell you about are also tied to other disorders, okay? Whether it's ADHD or autism or other mental disorders, okay? The exception is low resting heart rates, okay? It doesn't predict any other mental disorder other than psychopathy/antisocial personality disorder, okay? Which makes it quite unique. It's also found independent of potential confounds, so how much one exercises, their age, and so on, okay? And indeed, criminals who have children with a lower resting heart rate than non-criminals. Okay, so we've talked about the fact that there is a heritable component to criminality. Okay, and it's hard working out what might actually be the factor being passed on from one generation, predisposing children to being more likely to commit crimes. This could certainly be part of that picture, right? If that's something that's clearly heritable. And it also has predictive abilities, right? I've showed you in the previous study that even at age 3, it predicted criminal convictions later on, including in the case of Raj with the lowest resting heart rate. In this study also, juvenile offenders, okay, had their heart rates measured. Those with a lower resting heart rate were more likely to reoffend, okay, than those with a higher resting heart rate. We have also more recent meta-analyses. In this one on the top here, interestingly, there were 15 predictors of crime. Okay, so abuse and early social experiences, low resting heart rates, and so on. Okay, 15 separate predictors. And then they controlled for the impacts that all have on each other. Okay, and a multiple regression model. Out of the 15, there were only 2, okay, that were independently still significant. Low resting heart rates and hyperactivity and attention issues in school, okay? So that's an interesting finding because we've already looked at the fact that stimulation-seeking theory and fearlessness hypothesis have both been used to try and explain criminal behavior pathways, okay? Certainly, children who are more hyperactive are going to be more likely to be stimulation-seeking, okay? And we'll talk about the fact that those with a lower resting heart rate typically more fearless. So this does seem to be good evidence that these are potentially 2 independent pathways into criminality, okay? And again, unique from the other predictors in that they're not really overlapping with other predictors of crime. Interestingly, actually, this low resting heart rate predicts even pretty mild antisocial behaviors at a smaller extent, to a smaller extent. For example, in Hong Kong, it's really frowned upon to jaywalk to cross the road when the green light for pedestrians isn't on. But still, some people will cross the road even when they're not supposed to. So they did one study comparing those who jaywalk versus those who don't. Okay, those who do had a significantly lower resting heart rates, okay, than those who obey the traffic signals and who don't jaywalk. It was a small difference, 2 beats per minute, okay, but it was statistically significant. Of course, we're talking about very, very mild antisocial behavior, if you would even call it that, right? The more extreme the antisocial behavior, the more extreme we would expect the difference to be, right? So this is leading right to the 2 possible explanations that we've already discussed. The first one is the fearlessness theory, that if you have a lower resting heart rate, especially in response to stressors, it's not going to have the other physiological deterrents, okay, that might deter someone with a high resting heart rate who would experience changes in breath, lightheadedness, sweating, and so on. So if you experience low resting heart rate during these stressors, you're more likely to go ahead with the crime you're thinking about. You're more likely to get into a fight without worrying about the consequences, okay? This fearlessness is going to predispose you to be more likely to commit crime. The other explanation is the stimulation-seeking theory, okay? That there is an optimal level of arousal, right? And I'm sure you can relate to that. There's times in which you feel as though you're too under-aroused and maybe you need a caffeine kick or something to get you a bit more buzzing. Sometimes you feel overstimulated, and sometimes you just need to retreat. Okay, so there's an optimal level of arousal. And again, this is arguing that for those with such low levels of arousal, such low levels of atomic functioning, such low levels of physiological responses, it's uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable state to be in. And so they're seeking out ways to increase their heart rate and to increase their levels of arousal. Indeed, in one study, we also looked at how prone one was to stimulation seeking. And it explains about 36% of the relationship between low resting heart rates and aggression. Okay. So again, it's unlikely that one of these is going to explain all cases. Okay. It's probably the case that fearlessness will explain some cases of criminals, stimulation seeking will explain others, maybe in some cases, even a bit of both. And again, longitudinal study, fearlessness, stimulation seeking, measured in young children at age 3, and then predicts aggressive tendencies at age 11. So a big part of this is classical conditioning, in that the functioning of the autonomic nervous system has a big role to play in developing a sense of right and wrong, feelings of guilt, feelings of shame, okay? Because you tie emotions, okay, to experiences in the past, and if they were unpleasant emotions, you avoid the behaviors associated with that, right? In order to not feel ashamed or guilt or shame in the future. Now, in this model, we're arguing that those with poor atomic functioning, okay, will condition less well, okay? So the classical conditioning model isn't going to fit them as well as the typical person. So they have a poor ability to form associations, okay, between two stimuli. And this therefore reduces feelings of anticipatory fear going forward. Because again, there hasn't been that association with potential punishments, with negative feelings, okay? And this also means a weaker sense of right and wrong develops. Obviously, they're therefore going to be less likely to avoid stimuli that can lead to punishments in the future, won't socialize as well, and are therefore more likely to be antisocial or criminal. Now, by this point, you all know the classical conditioning model in Pavlov's study, right? But what we're talking about here, you know, in Pavlov's study, it was the pairing of food and a bell, for example. In this scenario, we're talking about something more like this, right? A child steals, and then they're punished for it, and then this generates feelings of guilt or being upset or hurt, right? The association between the two, therefore, means that next time they even think about stealing the cookie, they're going to experience, again, discomfort, guilt, okay, because of the association formed prior. And that this is therefore going to deter them from stealing the cookie, right? Now, Hans Eysenck was a personality theorist, prominent, especially in the 40s and 50s, who had a personality perspective on what causes criminal behavior that was closely tied to what we're talking about in terms of impairments in conditioning. So Eysenck's model, remember, was that there are 3 major dimensions of personality: extroversion, neuroticism, psychotism. But he really looked at it in terms of physiological arousal. So extroverts were those who were chronically under-aroused and so seeked out stimulation in order to boost their levels of arousal, versus introverts who were chronically over-aroused and so avoided stimulation in order to not be overly stimulated. For him, neuroticism was all about the reactivity of the autonomic nervous system, how prone to stress you were, okay? Those higher in neuroticism, a more active autonomic nervous system, more prone, therefore, to stress. in psychotism was essentially low conscientiousness and low agreeableness, okay? Selfishness, self-centeredness, and a disregard for others, okay? Now, his prediction was that criminals would be high on all three, okay? His idea here was that extroverts were so stimulation seeking, okay? And they didn't have such typical levels of arousal that made it harder for them to condition. And that those extremely high in neuroticism had such an overreactive atomic nervous system that also made it difficult to condition. So he had the theory that this poor ability to condition was really at the core of what was causing criminal behavior. Now, the prediction that criminals condition less well is true, as we'll go on to see. It's been held up and supported. His idea on the personality correlates, not so much, okay? Psychotism, high, yes, does predict criminal proclivities. Extroversion, well, psychopathic offenders are usually higher in extroversion, okay, than the norm. It's not so much true for non-psychopathic offenders, okay? But psychopathic offenders are actually extremely low in neuroticism, okay? So Isaac kind of got that part backwards, okay? But his idea that conditioning poorly increases the odds of crime has good support, okay? We have a meta-analysis finding that 12 out of the 14 had significant results for poor conditioning in the antisocial groups. Following this, 6 more studies published. All 6 of them had significant results in the antisocials poorly conditioning. Poor conditioning linked to higher callous unemotional traits, whereas better conditioning was linked to more impulsivity. Okay. Remember, callous unemotional traits, good early predictors of psychopathy. In one study, when looking at the difference between reactive and proactive aggression, particularly poor fear conditioning tied to proactive aggression, that would make sense, right? Because reactive aggression is in the heat of the moment, right? Whereas proactive is carefully planned, okay? And if you're carefully planning something antisocial, that might be when a high heart rate deters you, right? Or feelings of guilt and shame over doing this, okay? Whereas with reactive aggression, you're not really thinking about the outcome, you're just acting in the heat of the moment impulsively, right? So it's more in the case of proactive aggression in which you're going to be thinking about the outcome. A more recent study, absence of fear conditioning in offenders. Behavioral inhibition mediating the relationship, okay, between poor conditioning and antisocial behavior. So behavioral inhibition coming from Jeffrey Gray's model, right? Jeffrey Gray was a doctoral student of Hans Eisnick, well regarded for his book on the neuropsychology of anxiety. His idea was that there was 2 basic systems: the behavioral approach system that ran on dopamine, that encouraged you to go after what you want, okay, responded to incentive rewards, and then the behavioral inhibition system, okay, that responded to cues for punishment and threats, okay, telling you to stop the behavior that you're currently on way to complete. And then another study, inmates who felt higher rates of guilt, less likely to reoffend. That seems pretty simple, right? Then again, those who actually have feelings of guilt likely have good conditioning, right, in comparison to those who aren't experiencing any guilt for the crimes that they've committed. We have another longitudinal study here from Mauritius. The fear conditioning measured ages 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8. And then following up at age 8 to measure their rates of ADHD, antisocial behavior, conduct disorder, aggressive tendencies. You can see the highly aggressive group, the red line here, conditioned less well across the ages, right, in comparison to the less aggressive group, okay, which is conditioned significantly better, especially after around ages 5.5, ages 6, okay, which is really when feelings of shame, empathy, guilt begin to emerge, in which one develops theory of mind, right, taking on the perspectives of others and so on. And then also higher rates of aggression, antisocial tendencies, hyperactivity, and all those who have conditioned poorly. Though the difference in hyperactivity is non-significant, okay? So it's only really significantly predisposing one to be more antisocial and aggressive. So antisocial, non-aggressive, right, would be when there isn't that physical aggression, but there is still little regard for others, little empathy, little compassion, right? Now, in one of the best studies, again from Mauritius on this, at age 3, fear conditioning was assessed in nearly 1,800 children, okay? So what's happening here is that sweat production is being measured in response to a neutral stimulus, and then sweat production measured in response to a conditioned stimulus, okay, that they've been exposed to previously, and it's been paired with a high-pitched noise that's distressing, okay? And so this negative association should result in some fear response, okay? Think of the John Watson Baby Albert study, right? In that study, Baby Albert wasn't afraid of the rats, but when John Watson struck the hammer against the iron bar, eventually there was a association formed that was negative in Baby Albert's mind between the rat and the horrible noise. So something less extreme is occurring in this study, right? And then 20 years later, at age 20, the researchers looked to see which ones have a criminal record. Over 100 of them do. And then they're matched 2-for-1 to non-criminals, matched on gender, ethnicity, early evidence of shyness and social adversity and other personality markers. Now, the result was that 20 years ago, at age 3, there was no difference in sweat production to the neutral stimulus, okay? But in response to the conditioned stimulus, okay, there was a significant difference. The controls reported good fear conditioning, high sweat production in response to the conditioned stimulus, okay? Whereas the controls, no real difference in sweat production between the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. So they haven't fear conditioned, okay? Now we know that the amygdala is crucial for fear conditioning, and we've already talked about the fact that psychopaths have a smaller amygdala and a less active amygdala. This is further evidence over the role of the amygdala, because poor fear conditioning, which implicates amygdala dysfunction, okay, means that one has a lack of fear over punishments, and that they're more likely to grow up to be criminals, even 20 years later, okay? It would make sense, because if you think about committing a crime, again, you're going to be thinking about all of the consequences. You're going to have increasing heart rates. This is going to deter you because of your conditioning, right? For those who haven't made this association, haven't been conditioned in this way, haven't been conditioned to have an emotional reaction to doing something wrong, they're less likely to be deterred, right? And more likely to go ahead with it. So in the Baby Albert study, right, that shows us that Baby Albert had good conditioning. He had a good amygdala because he formed the association. If he was like these criminals when they were age 3, he wouldn't have been afraid of the mouse or the rat. he wouldn't have formed the association, he wouldn't have fear conditioned well, which would have told us poor amygdala function. Any questions? Make sense? Well, we have to be careful over labeling high-risk children, right? We've looked at the fact already that nothing is determined, right? The difference between Raj and Joel, who grew up to be the Miss Mauritius competitor. We've looked at the difference between Ted Kaczynski and the bomb diffuser, right? So this fearlessness could predispose one to different routes, not necessarily crime, but maybe to some other job, okay? Such as the bomb diffuser example. Now, it certainly is the case that the earlier intervention occurs, okay, the more likely it is to be successful, okay? You know, we've just looked at the fact, right, that in all of those studies, even at age 3, high-risk children were identified, and then a substantial number of them grew up to commit crimes, okay? If something had been done 20 years ago, when those children were identified as being high risk, maybe they wouldn't have committed the rapes and murders and robberies and so on that they then grew up to commit as part of this research, right? So it's important, therefore, to take into account the role of biology, and therefore maybe this could help us identify those who might be able to benefit, okay, from certain interventions. But again, have to be careful not to label those who are destined, because no one's destined to be antisocial. So I've told you there about the role of poor conditioning, low levels of arousal, low resting heart rates. Okay. What we're looking at are comparing controls to criminals who were caught and convicted, right? But there is another part of the story, and that's criminals who don't get caught. Okay. They're unlikely to be included in our research studies. We don't have as much insight into them. But sometimes there's some unique studies that are able to study this sample. It's a small sample they're all recruited from a temp agency in Los Angeles. The researchers have permission from the Department of Justice to not disclose any confessions over crime, no matter what the crime is, okay? In fact, they would be criminally liable, the researchers, if they did report the crimes, okay, after it's been disclosed. So we have 26 controls who are not diagnosed with an antisocial personality disorder and who score low on all these measures of psychopathy, okay? And then we have psychopaths who score high on all these measurements of psychopathy. We have 16 unsuccessful psychopaths who went to prison and were convicted, arrested for their crimes. And then we have successful psychopaths who disclose crimes they've committed to the researchers, and they were never caught. And these crimes include cases of rape and murder. You can see the scores on the psychopathic checklist out of 40, right? The controls, about 11, okay? The successful psychopaths who got away with their crimes, about 28. So it's higher than the threshold for research purposes of psychopathy, which is 25. And the unsuccessful psychopaths even higher, 31 to 32, okay, on average. So these research participants rather, have their prefrontal gray volume measured. They have their executive function measured on a whole range of tasks, like the one you looked at, the no-go task and the Wisconsin car sorting task and the Iowa gambling task and so on. And then their heart rate is measured at rest, and their sweat production is measured at rest. And then they're given a mild stressor. They're told, oh, by the way, you need to prepare a quick presentation, and you're going to present in front of an audience. Okay, that's, no real warning. And so during this, we measure their heart rates a few more times, their sweat production a few more times. Now, the green are controls. Let's compare them first of all to the unsuccessful psychopaths, okay? Because we've mostly been looking at criminals who were caught, so some of this shouldn't be surprising. So controls in green versus unsuccessful psychopaths in red. The red, substantially lower volumes of prefrontal cortex volume. That's not surprising. We've already looked at the fact that there's a difference here, okay? Differences in executive function between controls and unsuccessful psychopaths. Unsuccessful psychopaths significantly lower. Again, not surprising. We've already looked at that from the other research. Heart rate versus the unsuccessful psychopaths. Unsuccessful psychopaths significantly lower at rest and during the stressor. Again, that's congruent with everything we've looked at today, right? Sweat production, again, unsuccessful psychopaths substantially lower in sweat production than controls, right? Again, congruent with everything we've looked at today, okay? So let's look at these successful psychopaths who got away with their crimes because they're the more unique criminals. No significant difference in prefrontal gray volume between them and the controls, okay? And actually substantially higher executive functioning than the controls. Not too surprising, maybe it makes sense. They have to be fairly smart to get away with their crimes, right? Let's think back to Randy Kraft, right? The multiple murderer who had good prefrontal cortex function, okay, who had a high IQ, right? He was one of the exceptions in the sample of killers, right? And again, these are the exceptions, right? What about heart rate? Interestingly, it's significantly different at rest from the controls, but during the stress, it's comparative to the controls, no significant difference. And in sweat production, no significant difference between them and the controls either, okay? So again, these successful psychopaths seem to differ from those who were caught in several ways. Now, it's a fairly small sample, so we have to be careful not to conclude too much from this, okay? But it's a pretty unique opportunity to get insight into our unstudied population. So the unsuccessful psychopaths, just to sum up, poor frontal functioning, low reactivity in the autonomic nervous system, right? Low levels of arousal, poor sweat production, low resting heart rate, reduced prefrontal gray volume, whereas the successful psychopaths, better frontal functioning, increased prefrontal gray, high atomic reactivity, telling us that they have conditions, you know, they probably do know the difference between right and wrong. They maybe just don't care. And they're able maybe to avoid detection, maybe in part because of their better conditioning versus those with poor conditioning. Okay. Questions on anything I've covered today?